I've heard people say that when a marriage unravels, it never happens all at once. They say it comes apart thread by thread, so quietly that you don't feel the cold air rushing in until it's already too late to patch the holes. I used to think that was just something people told themselves to feel better about their own mistakes. But the truth is, sometimes it is that quiet. Sometimes, the person you trust most can look you straight in the eye and swear you're the only one. And you'll believe them because the alternative, that your life has been built on a lie, is too awful to consider. My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm 67 years old. And for nearly 40 years, I was the kind of wife who believed loyalty was the highest virtue. The kind of woman who thought marriage meant sacrifice, and that if you were patient and good and forgiving, everything would come right in the end. I married David when I was just 24, wide-eyed and certain that love could fix anything. He was 30 then, ambitious and magnetic, the sort of man who could command a room without raising his voice. My friends used to say I was lucky, that I'd caught someone destined for success. And for a long time, I believed them. We built our life slowly, brick by brick, a modest house that grew nicer as his consulting career took off. 2 children, Emily and Sam, who became the center of my universe. I worked as an elementary school teacher, pinching pennies so we could pay off the mortgage early and send our kids to good colleges. When David's work began requiring more travel, I told myself it was just the price of progress. I remember the first time he missed our anniversary. It was our 22nd. He called me from a hotel in Chicago, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft and practiced. "I swear I'll make it up to you." And he did. Flowers delivered to the house, a sapphire pendant I still kept tucked in my jewelry box, though I hadn't worn it in years. That was the first thread I felt loosening, but I convinced myself it was nothing, just a blip in an otherwise steady marriage. I told myself that again and again over the years. When he forgot birthdays, when he came home late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine, when he spent weekends catching up on reports in his study with the door locked. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway, hand hovering over the doorknob, my chest tight with a suspicion I couldn't name. But I never turned the handle. I never asked the questions I should have. Because I was afraid of what the answers might do to the life I'd spent decades building. Until the night everything finally cracked wide open. It was late March, one of those chilly evenings when the wind slips under the eaves and rattles the windows. I was sitting alone in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea cooling in my hands. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, counting off the hours David had been away. He'd called just after dinner. "Don't wait up," he'd said, sounding distracted. "The client dinner is running longer than I expected." I'd murmured something about being careful driving home and hung up. But the moment the line went dead, something in my stomach twisted. I tried to shake it off. I tried to tell myself it was just the loneliness talking. Around 11:30, I wandered upstairs to our bedroom. As I passed David's study, a stack of papers on the corner of his desk caught my eye. It wasn't unusual for him to leave invoices and contracts scattered around, but something about the way that manila envelope was wedged beneath his ledger made me pause. I don't know what compelled me to reach for it. Maybe all those years of silencing my instincts had finally caught up with me. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. The envelope was heavier than I expected, and when I lifted the flap, a sheaf of credit card statements slid into my hand. The top page was folded over, but the header was unmistakable. 4 Seasons Hotel, Boston. I unfolded the statement, my heart thumping so loudly I thought I might faint. The first line leapt off the page. Executive Suite, $2,480. I blinked, reading it again, my vision blurring. The date was just 2 weeks ago, the same weekend he'd sworn he was in Chicago for a conference. I pressed my palm to my mouth to keep from crying out. The room seemed to tilt around me, the floor dropping away beneath my feet. For a few seconds, All I could hear was the clock in the hall, still ticking steadily, mocking me, counting down the years I'd wasted loving a man I never really knew. 100 questions crowded my mind. Who was he with? How long had it been going on? Did our children know? Had everyone known but me? I wish I could say I walked downstairs and waited for him to come home so I could confront him, that I demanded the truth. But the truth is simpler and sadder. I put the envelope back exactly where I'd found it. I smoothed the stack of journals on top until it looked untouched. My hands shook so badly I had to brace myself against the edge of the desk. Then I turned out the light and went to bed alone. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and felt something inside me harden into a resolve I didn't know I still possessed. I was 67 years old. I had spent my life being the good wife, the forgiving wife, but I wasn't going to be the blind wife any longer. That was the night I decided I would uncover every lie, and when I did, I wouldn't be the one left ashamed. The morning after I found the receipt, I woke before sunrise, the covers bunched in my fists, my heart thumping like I'd run miles in my sleep. David hadn't come home until after 2. I'd heard him moving around downstairs, keys hitting the table, the refrigerator door creaking open. When he finally crept into the bedroom, I feigned sleep. He smelled like hotel soap and something floral I didn't recognize. I kept my breathing even, my eyes shut, though every muscle in my body was coiled tight as wire. I thought I'd be angry when the sun came up. I expected rage to hit me in a great cleansing wave, but all I felt was bone-deep weariness, the kind that seeps into your spine and makes you wonder if you've ever really been awake. I lay there listening to the shower running and told myself I could still pretend. I could stuff that envelope back under his ledgers and carry on as though none of it had ever touched my life. It would be easier, safer, less humiliating. But when he emerged, fresh-shaved and humming under his breath, something inside me snapped. I realized that if I didn't do something now, if I let this slide, I'd be volunteering to live the rest of my days as the sort of woman people pitied behind closed doors. And I'd be damned before I let that happen. So I sat up and looked him straight in the eye. "Was Chicago productive?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He paused, just for a heartbeat, before nodding. "It was fine," he said, tugging on the cuffs of his dress shirt. "Exhausting, though." Our eyes met. His were flat and placid, the way they'd always been when he was hiding something. "Did you get much work done at the hotel?" I pressed, testing him. He blinked, a tiny tick in his left cheek twitching. "Plenty," he said. "Long days. Why?" I almost laughed. It was so easy for him. Lying came to him like breathing. "No reason," I murmured, and turned away before he could see the fury blooming in my chest. That morning, I made the first decision that would change everything. I called our bank. I'd never thought much about our finances beyond paying bills and balancing the checkbook. David handled investments, retirement accounts, the big expenses. It was easier that way, so I'd believed. But when the woman on the phone started reading back transactions, I felt like I was listening to a stranger's life. Multiple hotel charges, restaurant tabs exceeding $500, a jewelry purchase from a boutique I'd never stepped foot inside, all in the past 6 months. "Would you like me to email you the statements?" the banker asked, her tone polite, unaware she was methodically dismantling my marriage one-line item at a time. "Yes," I whispered, my throat raw. "Please." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. I thought about the Margaret I used to be, the woman who believed David was simply working late, who would have defended him to anyone who dared to suggest otherwise. That version of me was gone. I needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to call my daughter Emily. She was too close to her father, too loyal. Instead, I dialed someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my cousin Jane. Jane answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, curious, and when I told her what I'd discovered, She didn't waste time trying to soothe me with empty platitudes. "Margaret," she said, her voice low, "you need more proof. You need to be sure before you confront him, because the moment you do, this marriage is going to change forever." I closed my eyes. I already knew she was right. "Do you know a good private investigator?" I asked. There was a beat of silence. Then Jane said, "I'll text you his number." I hung up and stared at the kitchen table, my thoughts spinning like a storm. It felt absurd, hiring a private detective like some suspicious socialite in a cheap paperback. But the truth was, I didn't know how else to do this. I needed more than receipts. I needed something undeniable. That afternoon, I drove across town to the PI's office. The place was a nondescript little suite above a tax accountant, the kind of place you'd walk past without ever wondering what secrets were being sorted out inside. His name was Alan Markham. He was in his 50s, with kind eyes and a voice that was neither pitying nor cold. I appreciated that. When I slid the credit card statements across his desk, he didn't flinch. "I'm guessing you want photographic confirmation," he said gently. "Yes," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "And anything else you can find, phone records, receipts, anything." He nodded, taking notes in a small leather-bound book. "How long do you think this will take?" I asked. He looked me squarely in the eye. "That depends on how bold he's being." I almost laughed. David had never lacked boldness. He'd just been clever enough to keep me distracted. When I stood to leave, Alan reached across the desk and rested a hand briefly over mine. "This is going to hurt," he said softly. "But sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set you free." I nodded, though the words lodged in my throat like splinters. Driving home, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older than I remembered, more tired. But there was something else in my eyes, too. Something I hadn't seen in years. Resolve. That night, as I lay alone in our bed, I realized I was no longer afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of what would happen if I looked away again. The next week passed in a haze. I kept to my usual routines: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, coffee with my neighbor Martha on Thursday mornings, evening phone calls with my son Sam to check on the grandkids. If anyone noticed how carefully I was going through the motions, no one said a word. David carried on as though nothing had shifted, breezing in late most evenings with rehearsed apologies and tired sighs. He had always been a skilled performer, but now that I knew to look, the cracks in his mask were obvious. Once, I caught him standing in the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking so softly I could barely make out the words. "No, she doesn't suspect anything," he whispered. Then, after a pause, a low laugh. "I'm telling you, Julia, everything is under control." The sound of that name, Julia, slid under my skin like a blade. I stood motionless in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. Julia. I tried to picture her, but all I could see was a shapeless silhouette with my husband's hands on her waist. He must have heard me shift, because he turned, and just like that, the laugh vanished. His face rearranged itself into a mask of mild surprise. "Margaret," he said too quickly, "I didn't hear you." I forced a smile so brittle it might have cracked if I tried to speak. "I was just coming in to get some water." He watched me, those calculating eyes flicking over my face, searching for evidence I'd heard too much. But I'd learned from the best. I let my gaze drift past him, as though I hadn't heard a thing. When I finally escaped to the bedroom, I shut the door and pressed my back to it, fighting the wave of nausea rising in my throat. Julia. I turned the name over in my mind until it no longer sounded human, until it was just a noise, something meaningless. But deep down, I knew nothing about this was meaningless. 2 days later, Alan called. His voice was quiet but edged with something I recognized immediately: pity. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I think you'd better come in." I don't remember the drive to his office. I only know that by the time I walked up the narrow staircase, my heart was hammering so hard I felt faint. Alan ushered me inside, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. A plain manila folder sat in the center, innocuous as a grocery list. He didn't speak at first, just pushed it toward me, his eyes steady. I don't think any amount of bracing could have prepared me for what I saw. The first photograph was taken in the lobby of the Four Seasons. David stood near the reception desk, his arm draped casually around a woman's shoulders. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, and pretty in that polished, unremarkable way some women cultivate, all expensive highlights and smooth, unlined skin. But it wasn't her appearance that made my vision darken. It was the familiarity in the way he touched her, the intimacy of his hand at the small of her back, the way she looked up at him and smiled. The next photo showed them walking down a hallway, fingers laced together. The third was even worse. The two of them in an elevator, her head tipped onto his shoulder, his lips pressed to her hair. I flipped through them slowly, methodically, as though each image were a page in a story I'd already known, but refused to read. Alan didn't interrupt. He waited until I set the photos down before sliding another stack of papers across the desk. Credit card receipts, hotel records, restaurant bills. He's been seeing her for at least 9 months, he said gently. Possibly longer. I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. Her name is Julia? Yes. Alan hesitated. Julia Parker. I closed my eyes. Parker. That name carried a weight I hadn't expected, dredging up memories I'd buried decades ago. Parker, I whispered. You're sure? I confirmed it through public records. He paused, searching my face. Why? Because I knew that name. Because Julia Parker wasn't just some stranger who'd crept into my life. She was the daughter of David's oldest friend, Charles Parker, the man who'd died 15 years ago. The man who'd once trusted David with everything, including, apparently, his only child. I pressed my fingertips to my temples, trying to steady the sudden vertigo. How long have they been engaged? I asked, my voice so calm it startled me. Alan blinked. Engaged? There was a receipt, a dinner reservation listed as an engagement celebration. He hesitated, then turned to his computer. After a moment, he clicked open an email and rotated the screen so I could see. A grainy photograph filled the monitor. David and Julia at a small corner table in a restaurant I recognized instantly. La Boucherie, the same place he'd taken me for our 30th anniversary. In the picture, Julia's left hand was lifted delicately, and on her third finger gleamed a diamond ring I knew I hadn't paid for. A hollow ache bloomed in my chest. Alan cleared his throat. It appears she's under the impression he's finalizing his divorce. I let out a shaky laugh, the sound brittle as old glass. Is she? I rose on unsteady legs, gathering the photos and papers into a neat pile. Thank you, Alan. You've done exactly what I needed. He stood too, concern lining his face. Mrs. Ellison, Margaret, are you sure you're all right to drive? No, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. But I'll do it anyway. Because if there was one thing I knew with absolute clarity, it was this. I was done being the last to know. When I got home that afternoon, I set the folder on the kitchen table and sat staring at it, willing myself to feel something other than numb. Rage would have been easier, even grief would have been a relief, but all I felt was this heavy, silent vacancy, like someone had scooped out everything I'd ever trusted and left me hollow. David's car wasn't in the driveway, which was just as well. I needed time to decide what to do next. I made myself a cup of coffee I barely tasted, then carried the folder upstairs to our bedroom and tucked it beneath the sweaters on my side of the closet. It felt symbolic somehow, like burying the last illusions of our marriage among the things that used to keep me warm. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photographs on the dresser. Our wedding portrait, the two of us standing side by side in the church, beaming with that naive, untested certainty. Another from a vacation in the Adirondacks, David with his arm around my shoulders, both of us bundled in fleece and smiling. Had he been lying even then? Or had he only learned to lie later, after the decades of polite compromises and disappointments? I didn't know, and for the first time, I realized it didn't matter. The man in those pictures didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never had. That night, when David came home, I was already in bed with the lights off. He paused in the doorway, as if he could sense the shift in the air. "You're still awake?" I didn't answer. He hovered a moment longer, then let out a tired sigh. "I'll be in the study if you need me." The door clicked shut behind him. I waited until I heard the familiar sound of the cabinet door in the kitchen opening, where he kept the bottle of scotch he thought I didn't know about. His routine was predictable. A glass of liquor, a call he'd pretend to take outside, a text or two sent in secret. And then he'd sit at the dining table, reading the same newspaper he'd already scanned on his phone, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. The next morning, I called our attorney, Richard Klein. We'd worked with Richard for years. He handled our wills, the estate plan, the paperwork when we sold David's mother's house. He was a gentleman, and I knew if anyone could guide me through what was coming, it would be him. When he picked up, I tried to keep my voice from shaking. "Richard, it's Margaret Ellison. I need to discuss something important, privately." He didn't ask any questions, just scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I spent the hours before the meeting pacing the living room, replaying every conversation David and I had shared in the last year. Every carefully constructed lie. Every time he'd kissed me goodnight with Julia's perfume still clinging to his shirt. By the time I arrived at Richard's office, the numbness had begun to fracture into something hotter and sharper. He welcomed me into a small conference room and waited patiently while I slid the folder across the polished oak table. I didn't bother easing him into the story. I laid it all out, every humiliating detail. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair and let out a low breath. "Margaret," he said gently, "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how painful this must be." I swallowed around the knot in my throat. "I need to know what my options are. If he's been spending our marital assets—" "He has," Richard interrupted softly, tapping the receipts. "And that will matter. Massachusetts considers any significant expenditure on an affair as dissipation of assets. In other words, he's effectively stealing from you." I nodded, my heart hammering. "Do you want to proceed with a divorce?" he asked. I stared at my folded hands, the wedding band glinting dully on my finger. For so long, I'd believed leaving was impossible, that I was too old, too dependent, too invested in the life we'd built. But sitting there in Richard's office, I felt something shift in me. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." Richard nodded, his expression calm and reassuring. "Then we'll begin gathering everything we need: financial records, property documentation, any evidence you've collected. I'll file the petition as soon as you give the word." I thought I'd feel relief saying it aloud, but instead there was just a cold, focused clarity. On my way out, I stopped in the hallway to steady myself. My legs felt unsteady, my palms damp. Divorce at 67. It felt like stepping off a cliff, but I reminded myself that staying would have been a slower kind of death. When I got home that evening, David was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta. He looked up and smiled like nothing was wrong. "You're home early," he said. I set my purse on the counter and studied him. The lines around his eyes, the thinning hair, the familiar gesture of wiping his hands on a dish towel. If I didn't know better, I could have believed he was still the man I'd married. But I did know better. "I have some errands to run tomorrow," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be out most of the day." "Sure," he replied, turning back to the stove. Take your time. He didn't even look up when he said it. He never noticed the way my hands trembled as I walked away. But in that moment, I promised myself he would notice soon enough. Because it wasn't enough to leave him. I wanted him to understand exactly what he'd destroyed. I don't know what I expected the next morning to feel like. Maybe I thought that once I decided to end the marriage, I'd feel lighter, unburdened. But the truth was, I woke up feeling like I'd swallowed stones. It's a strange thing to look at someone you've loved for 40 years and realize you've become a stranger in your own life. That every ritual, coffee together, the evening news, the little check-ins before bed, was nothing but camouflage over a rot that had been spreading for longer than you dared imagine. I had planned to confront him that day, to set the photographs and receipts on the dining table and demand he look me in the eye while he explained how he could stand in a church decades ago, slip a ring onto my hand, and then spend the rest of our lives reducing me to an afterthought. I rehearsed the words in my head all morning, pacing the living room until I felt dizzy. But as the hours ticked by, a cold practicality started to settle over the edges of my fury. I kept thinking about Richard's warning. Once you confront him, he'll start moving money, hiding accounts. He'll protect himself first, and you'll be left sifting through whatever crumbs he can't carry. I didn't want crumbs. I didn't want him to slip out the back door of our life with everything we'd built clutched in his fist. So instead of confronting him, I sat down at my desk with a yellow legal pad and started making lists. Accounts I needed copies of, passwords I still remembered, safe deposit boxes, insurance policies. The details that had once seemed too dull to bother learning. Now they were my lifeline. Around lunchtime, David called to say he wouldn't be home until late. Dinner with a potential client, he said, and I could almost hear the practiced smile in his voice. I murmured something neutral and hung up before my anger could spill over. The moment the line disconnected, I knew exactly where he was going. Julia. It was almost dark by the time I finished sorting documents and stashing copies in a box I planned to deliver to Richard the next day. I was about to make myself a cup of tea when my phone chimed, a text from an unknown number. Hi, Margaret. My name is Julia Parker. I'm sure you know who I am by now. I'm not writing to apologize. I'm writing to explain. My stomach clenched. I sat down hard in the nearest chair and read it again. David told me you two hadn't been living as husband and wife for years. That you'd agreed to stay together only for appearances. That your marriage was a formality. I believed him. I suppose you'll say I was foolish. Maybe I was. But I'm not the villain he's made me out to be. I stared at the screen, my pulse thumping in my ears. I thought about replying, about telling her exactly what I thought of her justifications, but in the end, I simply powered off my phone. She wasn't my concern, he was. And if he thought he could juggle me and Julia and his elaborate fictions forever, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I spent the next 2 days gathering the last pieces of evidence, statements from our brokerage account, email records of the hotel reservations he'd made, a printout of the photograph Alan had taken of their so-called engagement dinner. Each document felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage, but the more I collected, the calmer I became. On Friday evening, I sat at the kitchen table with everything laid out in neat stacks. The manila envelope, my notes, the list of questions I'd written and rewritten until the paper was nearly translucent. I imagined him coming through the door, setting his keys in the bowl by the fridge like always. I pictured the moment he'd see it all spread out and realize he was finally cornered. For an instant, I almost pitied him. Almost. But just before 7, my phone buzzed again, David's number this time. Hello? Hi, sweetheart, he said breezily. I know I said I'd be home by 8, but it looks like this dinner is going to run longer. Some unexpected investors joined us. I'll probably stay the night at the hotel so I don't have to drive back late. I closed my eyes, feeling something icy slip down my spine. He wasn't even bothering to be inventive anymore. I see, I said evenly. I'll call you in the morning, he continued, already distracted. Don't wait up. And just like that, he hung up. I sat very still, the phone still pressed to my ear long after the call ended. That was the moment I knew confronting him in private would never satisfy me. He'd lie, he'd deflect, he'd find some way to twist it back on me, to paint me as hysterical or vindictive. No, I didn't want a hushed confession in our kitchen. I wanted him exposed. I wanted everyone, his friends, his colleagues, the woman he was promising a future, to see exactly who he was. I gathered the papers into the envelope, sealed it shut, and tucked it into my purse. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Because I finally understood, the truth was only half the victory. The other half would be making sure he never hid behind his lies again. It was a strange thing, driving to the restaurant where my marriage was about to end. I'd been there before. La Boucherie, the same place David had taken me for our 30th anniversary. I still remembered the way he'd held my hand across the linen-draped table, telling me he couldn't imagine his life without me. Now, 15 years later, I was arriving alone, dressed in a navy suit I hadn't worn since my retirement party. I looked at my reflection in the visor mirror before I stepped out of the car. My hair had gone almost fully silver in the last decade. The skin around my eyes creased when I lifted my chin. But there was a steadiness in my gaze I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't here as David's wife anymore. I was here as the woman who'd survived him. The maitre d' looked up as I entered. He was young, soft-spoken, and his eyes widened slightly when I gave the name. I'm here for the Parker Ellison party, I said, my voice clear. Could you show me to their table? He hesitated, just for an instant, then nodded and gestured for me to follow. We wove through the main dining room to a private alcove where the rehearsal dinner was already underway. Candlelight gleamed off crystal glassware. Laughter drifted across the room like perfume. There he was. David sat at the head of the long table, Julia tucked neatly under his arm, her hand resting lightly over his. She looked radiant in a white cocktail dress, her hair swept up in a polished knot. He leaned in close, murmuring something in her ear that made her smile. Seeing it in person was worse than any photograph. I paused at the threshold, feeling the weight of every eye in the room swiveling toward me. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then David's head lifted, and our gazes locked. I will never forget the way his smile faltered, the way his mouth opened, searching for some shape of a greeting, and found nothing but air. Margaret? He croaked finally, his voice thin. I stepped forward, each movement measured, and set my purse on the nearest empty chair. My fingers found the edge of the manila envelope, and I withdrew it with a calm I didn't entirely feel. Julia, I said, my tone polite, almost conversational. I believe congratulations are in order. Her eyes darted to David, confusion flickering across her face. I'm sorry. I set the envelope down in front of her. You might want to take a look before you finalize anything. David half rose, one hand outstretched. Margaret, don't. Sit down, I said, louder than I meant to. The firmness in my voice startled even me. He froze, his mouth snapping shut. Julia glanced around, as if hoping someone would explain why the air had gone electric. Then she slipped the clasp on the envelope and slid out the first photograph. I watched the recognition bloom in her expression like a bruise. The room was so silent I could hear the candles sputtering in their glass holders. What is this? She whispered, lifting her gaze to David. He opened his mouth, closed it again. His complexion had gone waxy and gray. I reached into my purse again and pulled out a small stack of receipts, each carefully dated and labeled. I laid them one by one across the table like playing cards. The Four Seasons, I said, my voice steady. The Ritz, La Boucherie, all those lovely weekends away. A man at the far end of the table, a colleague of David's, if memory served, shifted uncomfortably and looked down at his plate. Julia's hand was trembling now as she picked up the receipt for the engagement dinner. "You told me—" Her voice trailed off. She swallowed, trying again. "You told me you were finalizing your divorce, that she agreed to step aside." David finally found his voice, but it came out thin and desperate. "Julia, listen to me." "She is listening," I said sharply. "We all are." I reached into my bag a final time and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, the notarized statement from Alan, detailing his findings. "This," I said, placing it in front of her, "is a timeline. It outlines the last 9 months of your affair, every lie he told, every dollar he spent that didn't belong to him." I heard someone gasp. Another woman put a hand over her mouth. David's face had gone from gray to nearly purple. "Margaret," he hissed, voice low and venomous, "you're humiliating yourself." I met his glare without blinking. "No, David. I'm freeing myself." Then I inclined my head toward the doorway. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the alcove. Their presence was deliberate, unhurried, an echo of the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Ellison," the taller officer said, voice cool and professional, "we'd like to ask you some questions about unauthorized expenditures and possible fraud." David's mouth opened and closed again. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to remember how to breathe. Julia recoiled from him, her chair scraping back as she stood. I felt the strangest thing then, something close to peace, because in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The story he'd built so carefully was over. And this time, I was the one holding the final word. I left the restaurant before the police finished speaking to David. Some part of me knew that if I stayed even a second longer, I'd start to shake, and I wouldn't give him or anyone else in that room the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. So I walked out into the cold spring night, the door closing behind me with a hush that felt almost sacred. My hands were steady as I fished my car keys from my purse. My heart, though, it hammered so hard against my ribs, it felt like it might crack something inside me. When I slid behind the wheel, I sat staring at the steering column, trying to remember how to start the car. It was ridiculous, really. I had planned every detail of this night down to the last sentence, I would say. But no one tells you what to do with the quiet that comes afterward, when all your anger has finally found its voice. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, letting the adrenaline drain out of my limbs until I could move again. Finally, I turned the ignition and drove home, the streetlights blurring past like distant candles. By the time I reached the house, it was nearly midnight. Every lamp was still on. David must have left them burning when he dressed for his dinner. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, taking in the familiar clutter, the shoes he'd kicked off by the stairs, the half-folded newspaper on the armchair. None of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. I walked through the kitchen, switching off lights one by one, and climbed the stairs in darkness. When I reached our bedroom, I paused in the doorway. My suitcase was already waiting in the corner, half packed with what I needed for the next few days. It was strange how easily I'd slipped into preparing for an exit, like some quiet part of me had always known this was where we'd end. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, listening to the silence of a house that felt emptier than it ever had when David was traveling. At dawn, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with David's name, and for a moment, I almost answered out of old habit. But then I remembered the look on his face when the officers stepped into that dining room, the sheer disbelief that he could be caught, that I could be the one to catch him, and I let it ring until the voicemail clicked on. He called again, and again. By mid-morning, I'd turned off the ringer. Instead, I called Richard. He answered on the first ring, sounding more alert than I expected for an early Saturday. "Margaret?" "It's done," I said simply. There was a moment of quiet on the line. Then he let out a soft exhale. How are you feeling? I glanced around the room, at the suitcases, the evidence still tucked in my purse, the hollow quiet where our marriage used to be. Like I'm finally standing on my own 2 feet, I said. Then let's keep moving, he replied. I'll file the divorce petition first thing Monday morning. We'll request a temporary injunction to freeze any joint accounts and assets until the financial disclosures are complete. Good, I said, and meant it. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, pressing my palm over my heart to steady it. I thought that would be the end of the revelations, that there would be nothing left for David to hide. But that afternoon, when I went to the bank to confirm the account freezes, the manager pulled me aside. Mrs. Ellison, she said gently, there's something I think you should see. She slid a folder across the desk, a printout of recent wire transfers I'd never authorized. The numbers blurred in my vision, thousands of dollars, siphoned out over months to accounts I didn't recognize. And then, at the bottom, the final withdrawal, $45,000, dated the week before, sent to a private account in David's name. My stomach turned. Can you confirm where these accounts are held? I asked, my voice brittle. She hesitated. They're offshore. The trail stops here, but this isn't unusual in cases where a spouse is preparing to leave. I gripped the edge of the desk to keep from swaying. So that had been his plan all along. He hadn't just been lying to me. He'd been liquidating everything we'd built together behind my back. When I stepped back out into the parking lot, the sky had clouded over. A cold wind swept across the pavement, lifting the edges of my coat. I pulled it tighter around me and thought about the first time David and I had stood in this very spot, grinning at each other as we signed the mortgage papers. I'd believed then that we were partners, that no matter what came, we'd face it together. How blind I had been. Back at the house, I set the new evidence on the kitchen table and just looked at it. This was no longer about infidelity. It was about betrayal in its purest form. He hadn't just broken our vows. He'd tried to rob me of the life I'd spent decades building. That was the moment my sorrow burned away, leaving something harder behind. Resolve. I would not let him take another thing from me. Not my dignity, not my future, not my peace. And if he thought I'd quietly fade into the background while he slithered off to start a new life, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I spent that weekend in a kind of cold, focused fury. While David kept calling, sometimes 6, 7 times an hour, I sat at the kitchen table with every folder spread out around me like a war map. Statements, receipts, notarized affidavits. Each line item was another piece of proof that everything I thought I'd known was an illusion. By Sunday evening, I was no longer even sad. I felt hollowed out, like some part of me had died, and what remained was a woman who no longer had anything left to lose. That was exactly the woman I needed to be. On Monday morning, I was already dressed when Richard called. Margaret, he said gently, the petition's filed. The injunction should freeze all your shared assets by the end of the day. Thank you, I told him. He hesitated. David is going to fight this. You know that. I'm counting on it, I said, because for the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was up against. It was nearly noon when I drove to the post office. I mailed copies of the receipts and the bank statements to our children, Emily in New Hampshire and Sam in Philadelphia. I thought long and hard about whether to involve them, but in the end, it felt more cruel to leave them in the dark. And besides, David would tell them whatever version of the story made him look like the wounded party. I wasn't going to let him rewrite this. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started combing through every email account I'd ever shared with him. Password resets, old correspondence, newsletters he never unsubscribed from. It was exhausting work, but with every hour I spent, the shape of his betrayal grew clearer. He hadn't just been siphoning off money to Julia. He'd been paying hush money to at least 2 other women. The first was a name I didn't recognize, Caroline Ruiz. The second made my stomach turn. Patricia Blanchard. Patricia had been our financial planner when David retired. She'd sat in this very kitchen, sipping coffee and telling us about safe investments and risk tolerance. I'd thought she was professional, respectful. Apparently, she'd been something else entirely. I stared at the payment record. A wire transfer for $8,500, labeled simply consulting. I felt my lip curl in disgust. Maybe some women would have closed the laptop right then, too tired or too heartbroken to keep digging. But I'd reached the point of no return. If he could lie that easily, if he could stand in the same room where we raised our children and plot how to steal from me, then I had no obligation to protect his secrets any longer. I took a deep breath, picked up my phone, and dialed Patricia's office. The receptionist sounded startled when I introduced myself. "One moment," she said. Patricia's voice came on the line seconds later, crisp and professional. "Margaret, I didn't expect to hear from you." "I'm sure you didn't," I said calmly. "I'm calling because I'd like you to explain the payment David made to you last November." There was a long pause, so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she cleared her throat. "Margaret, this isn't a conversation we should have over the phone." "I disagree," I said. "You were willing to take his money without any hesitation. You can be willing to tell me the truth now." Another pause, then softly, "I'm sorry. I didn't know he hadn't told you." I almost laughed. "Told me what?" "That he was planning to liquidate your retirement accounts," she whispered. "He said you were ill, that you needed a long-term care facility. He wanted to set up a trust in his name so he could manage the funds." My vision went dark. I braced a hand on the counter to keep from sinking to the floor. He'd been preparing to have me committed. I didn't remember hanging up. When I came back to myself, the phone was on the counter, and my heart was thundering so hard I thought it might burst. It took several minutes to breathe normally again. He hadn't just betrayed me as a husband. He'd tried to erase me as a person. I gathered every document, every damning scrap of evidence, and stacked them in a neat pile. Then I picked up my phone and called Alan, my private investigator. "Margaret," he answered, sounding concerned. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to find out everything you can about David's plans," I said. "Every account he's opened, every conversation he's had with an attorney, every document he's filed. I don't care how far back it goes." His voice softened. "Are you sure you want to know everything?" "Yes," I whispered. "I want every secret laid bare." After I hung up, I went upstairs to our bedroom. The suitcase I'd packed a week ago was still there, waiting. I opened it and added 2 more sweaters, a pair of sturdy walking shoes, my jewelry case. I didn't know where I would go yet, but I knew I couldn't stay here one more night, surrounded by the ghost of who I used to be. I zipped the suitcase and stood back, feeling something close to relief. This was no longer my home, and he was no longer my husband. I spent that night in a hotel across town. Nothing fancy, a clean, quiet place with a firm mattress and a tiny kitchenette. But when I shut the door behind me and turned the lock, a calm settled over me that I hadn't felt in years. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. It's a strange thing to realize that solitude can feel safer than the company of the person you trusted most. I brewed myself a cup of tea, sat at the little table by the window, and watched headlights crawl along the highway in the distance. Somewhere out there, David was probably still trying to reach me, calling anyone who'd listen to spin his excuses. But I didn't have to hear them anymore. I turned off my phone and let the quiet stretch around me like a shield. The next morning, Richard called to tell me the injunction had gone into effect overnight. Every shared account was frozen. Every automatic transfer was blocked. "You did the right thing," he said gently when I didn't respond right away. "I know," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. That afternoon, Alan called. His voice was taut with a tension that made my stomach twist. "Margaret, I found something you need to see." I drove to his office in a fog. Part of me wondered if there were even any surprises left to uncover. But when he handed me the folder, I realized how naive that thought was. Inside was a copy of a lease agreement. David had signed it 6 months earlier. A condo in San Diego, fully furnished, leased for a year in advance. I stared at the address, my pulse thrumming in my ears. He hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd already built the next stage of his life, down to the zip code. Alan shifted in his chair. I also confirmed something else. He had an attorney draft a petition for divorce back in January. He just never filed it. I closed the folder and set it on the desk with hands that barely trembled. He thought he could keep me in the dark until he was ready to discard me, I said. Alan's eyes were kind. I'm sorry. I'm not, I murmured. Not anymore. Because now I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I thanked Alan and left. But instead of driving straight back to the hotel, I found myself heading toward the house. I parked at the curb and sat behind the wheel, studying the place where I'd spent most of my adult life. The shutters David promised to repaint 10 years ago. The dogwood tree I'd planted the year Sam was born. The front steps where Emily had posed for prom pictures. All those memories layered over the truth that this house was just another stage where he'd performed the part of the devoted husband. I walked up the path and let myself inside. David was in the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me, his face went slack with shock. He ended the call and set the phone down carefully, as though any sudden movement might make me bolt. Margaret, he began, his voice gentle, rehearsed. I've been worried sick. Don't, I said sharply. We're past that. He flinched, his mouth snapping shut. I set the folder on the counter between us. I know about San Diego, I said. I know about the accounts. And I know you were planning to file for divorce the moment you thought you'd taken everything you could. His jaw worked, but no words came out. You lied to me for years, I continued, my voice low and steady. You looked me in the eye every night and made me believe I was still your partner, your priority. And all the while, you were preparing to abandon me. His face darkened. I didn't abandon you, he snapped. You left. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I laughed, a cold, brittle sound. I humiliated you? You did that to yourself. He stepped closer, his hands splayed in a pleading gesture. Margaret, think about what you're doing. You're throwing away everything we built. No, I interrupted, lifting my chin. You did that. The moment you decided to treat me like an obstacle to your happiness. We stood in silence, the old clock ticking in the foyer. You don't have to do this, he said finally, his voice softening. We can find a way to fix it. Fix it? My voice broke on a laugh. You're still pretending this is salvageable? His mouth tightened. After 40 years, don't you think we owe it to ourselves to try? I studied him for a long moment, the slope of his shoulders, the way his hair had thinned to a silver halo, the lines etched around his eyes. This was the man I'd shared a life with, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with everything. But he wasn't the man I'd married. Maybe he never had been. I took a deep breath and said the words I hadn't let myself speak out loud until that moment. I don't owe you anything anymore. For the first time, he looked afraid. I turned and walked upstairs to the bedroom. I retrieved my suitcase from the closet and wheeled it past him without a backward glance. At the front door, I paused. I'll let my attorney know where to reach me, I said quietly. From this point on, you can speak to me through him. I didn't wait for his response. I stepped into the sunlight, my heart hammering, my eyes wet. But I wasn't crying because I wanted him back. I was crying because for the first time in decades, I was finally free. I didn't know where I was going when I drove away from the house for the last time. I only knew I couldn't stay in that town one more day. Not when every grocery store aisle, every church pew, every coffee shop held ghosts of who I used to be. A woman who didn't ask questions because she was too afraid of the answers. So I turned the car south and kept driving until the roads grew wide and the air turned warm. I stopped only when I reached the coast, a quiet seaside town where no one knew my name. I rented a little cottage perched on a bluff above the ocean. It was nothing like the house I'd shared with David. No polished floors, no sprawling kitchen, no walls crowded with family photos. Just sunlight streaming through salt-speckled windows and the hush of waves below. For the first time in years, I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to make a decision. The first morning I woke there, I made a pot of coffee and sat on the porch in my bathrobe, watching the gulls wheel over the water. I'd expected to feel lonely, but what I felt instead was something quieter, deeper, like my own heartbeat had finally slowed enough for me to hear it. I'd spent most of my life living for other people. David, our children, the neighbors who expected me to show up at every church fundraiser with a casserole in hand. But now, there was no one to perform for. It terrified me. And it thrilled me. I'd been in the cottage 3 days when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I knew it was him before I even picked up. "Margaret," David said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't slept. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. "You can't just disappear," he pressed. "We need to talk." "There's nothing left to say." "You think this is going to make you happy?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You think walking away will fix anything? You'll end up alone, Margaret. Bitter. Broke. Is that really how you want to spend the last years of your life?" I looked out at the ocean, blue and endless, and felt something in me settle. "Yes," I said softly. "If it means never having to look at you again, then yes." He made a wounded sound, something between a scoff and a sigh. "You're not thinking clearly." "No," I corrected, my voice as steady as the tide below. "I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in 40 years." I ended the call. That night, I lay in bed with the windows open, the breeze stirring the curtains, and thought about how long I'd believed he was the only person who could keep me safe. How wrong I'd been. Over the next few weeks, the legal proceedings moved swiftly. Richard called to update me every few days. David, he said, had decided to contest the divorce after all. He'd hired a lawyer known for dragging things out, for trying to wear people down until they agreed to less than they deserved. It didn't work, because I wasn't that frightened woman anymore. The judge reviewed the evidence, David's hidden accounts, the siphoned funds, the photographs of him and Julia, and ruled decisively in my favor. I was awarded the marital home, though I knew I'd never live there again. Half of our investments, and enough restitution to ensure I would never have to depend on anyone again for the rest of my life. The day the final decree arrived, I sat on the porch with the envelope in my hands. I didn't open it right away. I traced my finger over my name, Margaret Ellison, and felt an ache in my chest. Not sadness, gratitude, because for all the years I'd wasted, all the nights I'd cried into the dark, all the ways I'd tried to convince myself that loyalty was more important than dignity, at least I hadn't stayed one day longer than I had to. A week later, I signed the papers to put the house up for sale. I didn't want it. It was nothing but an empty monument to the life David and I had pretended to have. The real estate agent asked if I wanted to keep any of the furniture. I told her she could sell everything, except the piano. That old upright piano was the one thing in that house that had ever been truly mine. When it arrived at the cottage, the movers set it near the front window, the keys gleaming in the afternoon light. I sat down on the bench and let my hands drift over the keys. For a long time, I didn't play. I just listened to the hush of the sea and thought about how much of my life I'd spent waiting, waiting for someone to love me better, waiting for things to get easier, waiting for permission to start over. Then I began to play. Slowly at first, then with growing certainty. The same song I'd learned as a girl. The notes filled the cottage, soft and imperfect and entirely my own. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. It's a curious thing what people assume about women my age. They think we're fragile, that we're too old to start over, too set in our ways to survive alone, that all we have left are memories, yellowed photographs in cracked frames, stories we tell to anyone who will pretend to listen. But sitting here now, I can say with certainty, they're wrong. We are stronger than anyone gives us credit for. I learned that in the weeks after the divorce decree arrived. I'd thought the hardest part would be facing the gossip, the curious neighbors, the pitying glances at the pharmacy, the polite questions from old friends who thought they were entitled to know every detail. But as the days passed, I realized I didn't care what anyone thought anymore. I'd already survived the worst, and it hadn't killed me. Emily came to visit not long after the house sold. She was quiet when she stepped into the cottage, her eyes sweeping over the simple rooms, the half-unpacked boxes, the piano by the window. "Mom," she began carefully, "are you sure you're okay out here by yourself?" I looked at her, my daughter, who'd once held my hand so tightly on her first day of kindergarten, and smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." She sat beside me on the porch, her gaze fixed on the waves. "Dad called," she said after a while. He wanted me to ask you to call him." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. "I have nothing left to say to him," I replied softly. Emily nodded, her jaw working like she wanted to argue, but then she let out a sigh and rested her head against my shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. For a moment my eyes burned. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to hear that. We didn't talk much more that day. Sometimes it's enough just to sit with someone who remembers who you used to be and loves the person you've become. After she left, the days slipped into an easy rhythm. I woke early and walked the bluff trail until the sun rose over the water. I learned the names of the shopkeepers in town, the woman at the bakery who always saved me the last cinnamon scone, the bookseller who recommended mysteries because he guessed I was done with love stories for a while. I planted herbs in mismatched pots on the porch. I practiced the piano every evening until my fingers ached. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to feel like myself again. Not the Margaret who had built a life around a man who never valued her. Not the Margaret who had spent decades waiting for gratitude that never came. Just Margaret. One afternoon, months after the divorce, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying the lines around my mouth, the silver in my hair, the softness in my jaw. Once, I might have looked at this face and only seen everything I'd lost. The years, the certainty, the comfort of believing I was loved. But now, all I saw was a woman who had survived, who had reclaimed her life, one deliberate choice at a time. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. It wasn't long after that Richard called again. "Margaret," he began, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I thought you'd like to know that David's settled." "Settled?" "He's agreed to pay the full restitution, plus damages for fraud." I closed my eyes, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding easing from my chest. "And he signed the release," Richard continued. "He will have no claim to your assets going forward." "Thank you," I whispered. After I hung up, I stood at the window, watching the wind push the waves toward shore. I didn't feel triumph, or bitterness, or even relief. I just felt finished. That was the gift in the end. Not vengeance, not victory, closure. A week later, I finally unpacked the last box. I set the old family photos in a drawer, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I didn't need to stare at it every day anymore. One evening, as the sky turned pink over the water, I set a fresh sheet of music on the piano stand. My hands hovered above the keys, And I thought about everything that had brought me here. The lies, the heartbreak, the slow unspooling of the life I'd once believed was unshakable. And I thought about the woman who had walked into that rehearsal dinner with her head high and her heart breaking, determined to show the world the truth. I had been that woman. I still was. My hands came down on the keys, and the music rose up around me, bright and imperfect and entirely my own. When I finished, I sat in the quiet and closed my eyes. I was 67 years old. I was alone. And for the first time, I knew that was exactly where I was supposed to be. The end was never the end. It was just the beginning.